Welcome. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am a professor of art history and history at USC and the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. And thank you so much for joining us in this Levan book chat, where we will be discussing Thomas Seifrid's new book, Staging the Absolute: Ritual in Russia's Modern Era, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2023. I do want to encourage everyone who can to turn on their camera. I see lots of people already have their cameras on. That is really great. This is a meeting among colleagues and students and friends, and so it is much nicer to see everybody present than to have just the names.
And the point being to intimidate me.
No, to celebrate you, Tom. Today's book chat is co-organized by the USC Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, so thank you so much. And we are, of course, celebrating the book of Thomas Seifrid, who is professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at USC. Joining him in conversation will be Galin Tihanov, who is a George Steiner Professor of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University, London, and Nancy Condee, who is Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Pittsburgh and the Director of the Center for Russian, East European Studies and Eurasian Studies. And the conversation will be moderated by Colleen McQuillen, who is Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures. Our proceeding today is very simple. Tom will start by giving us a brief introduction to the book, and then he will engage in conversation and answer questions from Professors Tihanov and Condee, roughly until 12:45, 12:40, sometime around there. And then we will open it up for questions from the audience. Colleen will invite you to raise your Zoom hand to ask any questions. So, Tom, many congratulations on your book, and please tell us about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Shucks is all I can say in response to you actually showing up for this. I thought by way of introducing the book, I would talk about how it evolved. I've been instructed not to read from the book as a way of introducing it. It began some years ago, many more years ago than I'd like to remember, in a reading of Bulgakov's novel, The Master and Margarita, which I'd read many times, of course, but on that particular rereading, it struck me as a curious work whose anomalies had to do, I thought, with something theatrical to it, a theatrical element. There was something distinctly operatic about it, which is not surprising. Bulgakov worked in the theater. He was enamored of Gounod's opera Faust. But also, it has this strange double structure with chapters in Moscow, chapters in Jerusalem. And at one point, let me just interject my own remarks here. I decided this replicated the structure of a puppet show type theater that was popular in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And no sooner had I hit on this brilliant idea than I discovered in reading Miron Petrovsky that he had gotten there first. So I don't know if one can get credit for being the second to notice something. One obvious model for the novel was the mystery play, and that ground had been covered. The widespread interest in mystery play in the modernist era of Bulgakov's youth, not only in Russia, meant the means to revive theater. But I began thinking about it, and two questions arose. First, what was the link to the Soviet era, in particular the Stalin era in which Bulgakov wrote this novel? If it wasn't just his nostalgia for a modernist youth, why was he mapping this now onto the Soviet, in particular the Stalinist context? Some of that ground had been covered too. There are excellent studies on the role that mystery plays played within modernism, Russian modernism, and also early Soviet street festivals. But as I read these things, I had a sense that the treatment was somehow incomplete, astute as it was, given the aims of that research. So I began to wonder, what is a mystery play as a symbolic form, especially in its interaction with urban space? Because one thing characteristic of mystery plays is they are staged in cities. And as I was thinking about those, I began to notice a variety of what seemed to me related phenomena. There were a lot of tales of second coming in the Russian fin de siècle, Christ, but also sometimes the devil. And I came to think of these as tales of intervention, as I call it in the book, But there were also projects and theories, meta-descriptions of Russian modernist drama, the Faust legend itself in its own right, and then also its enormous popularity at the end of the 19th century in Russia and on into the Soviet era, the puppet theater, and the modernist interest in the puppet theater, panoramas, Jerusalem, Kiev, Moscow, St. Petersburg as models of Jerusalem, cities in general, Soviet festivals replete with things like agitational trains, as they were called. And as I began to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, liturgy itself, if a modernist play, if the mystery play emerges out of liturgy, what the heck is liturgy? What is it doing? What is this thing, liturgy? So each of these turned out to be a fascinating cultural object in its own right, but I began to see them, I think, as linked by a shared impulse, not a single idea driving it all, but something more like what Deleuze and Guattari call a rhizome, or in more simple terms, a mental habitus, a network of looser connections, but a network all the same. And it's possible that I just think this way. I think my second book, The Word Made Self, takes a similar approach to a network of ideas within Russian philosophy of language. And anyone who works with this kind of approach will know that there's always a tension between centrifugal and centripetal forces. It might all fly apart at one moment, or it might all collapse. And if you want to tell me it did collapse, I welcome that comment. Another thing that happens when you do this kind of inquiry, performance kind of interest, lots of doors keep opening onto other complete landscapes, to borrow a metaphor of Nabokov's. You say, this suggests something about mystery plays. Well, rest assured, there's a lot of literature about mystery plays, or the liturgy, you start reading about literature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of it fascinating, sometimes difficult to rein in. But then I kept returning to the question, what did it all mean for Bulgakov's novel as a distinct document of Soviet and in particular Stalinist culture? And what was the eventual arc of my own narrative going to be? So I began asking, what is the implicit, whether it was conscious or maybe not even conscious or fully recognized, what was the implicit impulse behind Soviet rituals, especially as something that could be traced back via modernism and its interest in the mystery play, but to medieval mystery plays? What is being carried forward in all of these symbolic forms? I think that Bulgakov in his novel brings back to light the religious underpinnings of all of this in a way as a means of taunting the Stalin era with its real rather than assumed or declared preoccupations. In the center of it, after reading a lot of things and thinking about this, seemed to lay in this moment of judgment, with the ritual deployed as a means to do two things: to interrupt the course of history, that's a major aspect of all of this, but also interrupt it for what? In order to provide access to the absolute, but access to the absolute in order to stage a trial, to invoke judgment on the here and now, on history, on the historical moment. And at the end of, so the end of this, it seemed to me, was the 1930s and the show trials. And even though obviously Soviet rituals continued beyond that, I saw this as the natural, as the apex of this impulse within Soviet culture. And after I'd written the book, really, as I was sort of writing the conclusion, I began to think, without wanting to be reductionist at all, what were some of the implications that emerged from this that I had not had in my mind as I was working on it? And one, of course, and a number of these implications are issues in our field. What is the relationship between modernists and the avant-garde and Stalinism? Was this whole book, in effect, supporting Boris Groys's indictment of the avant-garde for having prepared the ground for Stalinism by giving it the form in which it could carry out its rituals? Was Mikhail Bakhtin somehow an apologist for all of this? Was he a theoretician of culture who resisted by fantasizing, imagining other forms of resistance to it, or was he actually replicating the oppressive forms by writing it in particular for Bakhtin about Carnival? And a thought that had never occurred to me while writing it emerged from it wasn't my editor at University of Toronto Press. Let me just state again, I think I stated this in my acknowledgements. Stephen Shapiro was an absolutely wonderful editor. I mean, this is an editor to dream about and to die for. But so, when you submit a manuscript and the manuscript is being accepted and modified, there's always a moment. It's like in Star Trek. It goes to the Council of Elders, and they come. You never talk to them, but they come back with questions transmitted via your editor. And one of the questions that came back was, or is expressed as a concern, why would Western mystery plays be relevant to the Soviet experience? And the first easy answer was that, well, because the Russian modernists had knowingly drawn on the medieval mystery play as a model used to revive drama. But also as I began to think of it, because I thought, well, Russia's a part of Europe, and Russia's heir to the same Judeo-Christian Christian mentality in this case. And so actually, in a way, I think the book could be read as a commentary on what can happen within a European culture when some of the implications of public rituals are carried to their logical conclusions, which of course is a specialty of the Russians. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if I've exhausted, I probably have gone over my 5 minutes, but those are my introductory remarks.
Very good. Thank you so much, Tom. Okay, so now we will hear from our invited guests, Professors Nancy Condee and Galin Tihanov. Please.
Thank you. I'll ask the first question, and it follows up actually on what you've been talking about, Tom, almost as if we had rehearsed this. That's extraordinary. I want to say very briefly that one of the reasons I'm excited about this experience is because this is a book that not only has a robust theoretical structure to it with which one could engage in dialogue, but it also happens to pick up on so many of the readings that we would routinely teach our PhD students. So in passing, one could comment upon Akhmatova's poem, Without a Hero, blocks 12, with Belly, with Mayakovsky, with Alyosha, with Platonov. One could go through the entire, early 20th century and also 19th century MA exam and pick up elements that are in dialogue with this. So the question that I want to ask you that plays upon what you've just said is theoretical scaffolding that you have not mentioned, but I think that are at the core of your thinking. They would include Militinsky for one, perhaps Lotman if you felt like commenting on it, but also Mona Azouf's festivals in the French Revolution. So I'm curious about how did any of those, in particular perhaps Azouf, inform or challenge or inspire your work in its early stages? When did it become clear that her core theses were ill-suited to what you were doing? Like, what kind of relationship is there, or resonances between other scholars that you had not mentioned, including our own dear Katie Clark, whom we have recently lost?
Yes. Katie Clark was a huge inspiration, and she leads the list of people whose absolutely outstanding scholarship on Soviet festivals existed. And I probably, to be completely honest about the origins of the idea, I was probably reading Master Margarita with Katerina Clark's work in the back of my mind. And the challenge in pitching this to a publisher was to show that I'm not simply replicating Katerina Clark's work, but that's a testament to her work as a scholar. I came up to Azouf and the French Revolution actually rather late. I was so steeped in the Russian topics, and for a long time, the Faust precedent and rethinking about Germany and medieval Europe. And then, of course, in due course, appropriately enough, I thought, wait, there's a precedent for this, which is the French Revolution. When you first come to that idea, though, what you discover in reading about Soviet festivals, they actually did not look much to the French Revolution. This was not the inspiration for early Soviet street festivals. It was rather the modernist fooling around, wanting to stage mystery plays in the middle of cities and all of that. So the modernist activity and set of interests was more relevant to early Soviet festivals, which is easy enough to explain because a lot of the initial directors, Piotrowski, Meyerhold, and so forth, had emerged out of that very milieu. And actually what happened to them in the initial phase of these Soviet rituals is they suddenly had handed over to them entire cities. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Natan Altman's decoration of Palace Square in Petrograd for the first anniversary of the revolution went over like a lead balloon. Now, the workers and soldiers did not like these avant-garde designs, but so Zuf came later. Militinsky and Lotman were very important paputchiki, fellow travelers, especially when I was thinking about folklore, myth, and in the case of Lotman, the puppet theater. But I did not start working on this idea out of reading Militinsky and Lotman. I think I knew enough to turn to them when I hit those topics.
Yeah, I'm going to pass the next question on to Galin because I would love to follow up, but let's keep moving because the time is fleeting. Galin, go ahead, ask the next question.
Thank you, Nancy. Tom, first of all, congratulations on this truly wonderful book. And wonderful it is, not least because of the breadth of comparative engagement with French material, German material, from medieval culture into the 21st century. And this comparative strength also leads me to ask you, where do you place yourself on this spectrum of scholars who would argue for Russian exceptionalism in how ritual is deployed on the one hand, or those who would seek to discern a broader phenomenon, probably a European phenomenon? And if the latter, where would you draw the limits of the patterns that you locate in the book?
Thank you, Galin. I'm especially pleased to hear you comment on I hope you're talking about the breadth of interest because you're a model for me in that. As far as where I would place myself on that spectrum, sitting here now, I realize one huge lack, which I would not want at all to try to redress, is a comparative study of similar rituals in Nazi Germany. And anyone with any knowledge of art history in our field knows Igor Galamstok has a book on totalitarian art, which compares Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and Communist China in their use of art. And I think rituals could be subsumed under that as well. I think that in the case of Russia, what you see, and again, I would simply have to bracket off Nazi Germany, which may be parallel. But what sets Russia apart is not that it is completely distinct from the European experience, but it allows itself to be more archaic than other cultures. It, in essence, stays stuck in a kind of medieval-looking mindset for reasons that have to do with the exercise of power within that culture. And what's interesting and paradoxical about it is that the initial impetus for a lot of these street festivals comes from the avant-garde in the Soviet era, and then that's essentially rejected. The Stalin era, it's either a complete rejection under the guise of continuing, 1st of May parades, 7th of November parades, under the guise of continuing that, either a complete rejection of the avant-garde agenda or a purifying of it from any kind of modernist avant-garde accoutrements to bring out the medieval, the nefarious medieval religious implications of this kind of festival. So I think, Russia is not exceptional, but it is different from much of Western Europe in this.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Back to Nancy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about space and the staging of the sublime, the locale of where the staging of the sublime takes place. You spoke repeatedly about Moscow, for example, as a potential receptacle or a vessel or a site where transcendence can happen, a place where it can be staged. And of course, it got me thinking about all the other potential sites or venues, churches, law courts, fields of battle, things that we might cluster into that fancy word heterotopias, whether that's appropriate or not. It might capture some kind of abstraction for which they can find a home. So here's my question. Would it be correct to say that perhaps increasingly such sites are purpose-built in order to conjure this up or to make this transformation happen. I'm thinking, for example, of the main cathedral of the Russian armed forces just outside Moscow as a place where the sublime is meant to be experienced and enacted. And I'm thinking of some kind of greater accelerated frequency to bring that about. And then arguing with myself, of course, I said, well, what about the Roman Colosseum? What was that if not a place for rapture? So I leave that as a kind of open question to which I don't have an answer.
No, I think the short answer is yes, at least on a transition to purpose-built structures. And I think I touch on some of this in the book, having to do with, in particular in the case of Moscow, a shift from early transformations, which were fairly superficial. You changed the name of the street, to the famous general plan for the reconstruction of Moscow, which envisioned things, as I mentioned, like blowing up buildings, tearing them down, and building new buildings, the most notorious being the Palace of Soviets, Dvorets Sovetov, never built, but it was supposed to have arches that could accommodate, processions of thousands of workers and soldiers and so forth. So that was part, and again, the Stalin and the Stalinist regime had ideal conditions. They didn't have to invoke eminent domain to take over the center of the city. And as far as what's going on in Putin era Russia, I haven't given that much thought, but yes, I would argue that cathedral is very much a part of this kind of project.
I mean, it seems to me that was the genius of Pussy Riot, that they saw that the church was the receptacle for that kind of transcendence, and they themselves captured it, took it hostage.
All of which, may I say, I personally regard as profane. I think there's nothing legitimately sacred about any of this activity. And if I may interject a comment, I have a brother who's a theologian and is teaching towards reaching the end of his teaching career, and sent me a note saying, oh, my students wanted my class report. And I said, can I watch? And lo and behold, he mentions this book in his class. And they were talking about whether in this case, it was American Protestantism and the idea that America was somehow the city on the hill, that America was the New Jerusalem. And I was pleased that he essentially invoked my ideas to say, no, this is all perverse. Which is an unstated point of it in the book, is that you go wrong trying to do this. You can't bring about the absolute, and it leads to repulsive consequences if you take it too literally and pursue it. So I would say that that's clearly going on in Putin's Russia.
I'm passing it back to Galin.
Thank you. In the book, you talk about this experience of escaping the mundane, and you quote Levack's phrase, evolutionary impatience. I was wondering, could this hugely speculative, but also radical science of people like Alexei Gastyev or Alexander Bogdanov, whom you briefly mention in the book, with the blood transfusion trials, with the pursuit of perpetual life, could all this be seen as part of this yearning for some kind of extra-historical escape that disrupts this evolutionary line, and maybe even couching this in the language of present debates, whether you see a potential relevance here of what you're grappling with for our conversations on transhumanism?
Wow, I will have to bracket the transhuman. Yeah, that's an interesting. I would have to give transhumanism more thought, but on the whole question of the phenomenon of interrupting history, it seems to me that what I attempt to describe in the book is part of a very broad paradigm shift from the mindset of the 19th century, which gave rise, among many other splendid things, to the realist novel. And I could go and symphonies as a privileged form of musical expression and so forth. The idea that human experience is most meaningfully rooted in time, and time that unfolds in history, and that the transcendent realm, although it sort of hovers over some imaginations about human life, is not really all that relevant. We don't attain meaning within the transcendent we attain here, which is why novels are long. This has been pointed out by many things, because you become who you are in a historical moment. That is widely rejected. Now, to what extent, I think we are to some extent, we come to believe that that was a kind of norm. Why? Because we're reading a lot of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Turgenev, where this is the norm, but it may actually be an aberration within the broader scale timeline of European history. Johann Huizinga, in his book on Homo ludens, and I think there's also a sort of assumption that the 19th century got it right. That's good. Yes, we, our lives are defined, meaning arises out of a progression of small moments, to paraphrase Saul Morson and his idea of prosaics. But that actually may be anomalous, or that may be the aberration in human experience. And Huizinga in his book Homo Ludens says, basically, the 19th century screwed it all up. What a dull century. They set aside the element. Now he's talking about the element of play. They didn't know how to play. They were so sober-minded. They took everything seriously. And parallel to that might be a return to an idea that humanity, people find meaning in the absolute. But then, of course, as this book, I hope, suggests, there's a certain danger in that. It can license, especially if it's in the hands of state sponsorship, it can license all sorts of negative outcomes. So did that answer your question at all?
Yes, in the sense that it really stimulates further thought, and on some other occasion we'll probably continue this conversation. Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, so I'm aware that our time is running away from us, and we must allow time for our colleagues also to ask questions. I hope that your questions are formulating in your own heads, and I'll try therefore to keep my next question short. I get excited about it. And Tom, I hold you to blame. If you write an exciting book, everybody wants to own it in their own way. So I'm already metabolizing your book according to my own, ways of understanding it. It seems to me in that spirit that if one begins to think of the range of different artistic media, that stage drama in particular occupies a place of potential expressiveness that's superior for transcendent phenomenon and experiences than other arts, more than cinema, more than painting, yes, more than the other arts. Drama performance offers us that experience, as Victor Turner would say, of the living performing their own lives in real time before our eyes. And therefore, would you agree that drama therefore has much greater potential than, let's say, television? We always speak of the power of television, but live drama has a new, and I'll say one more thing, then I'll stop talking. The reason why this question interests me is I just read on Radio Liberty an interview with Maria Davidova, who runs Salzburg Festival in drama. And she said that although one can be horrified at what's happening in the Russian Federation, unpredictably, live drama is flourishing. The number of really interesting plays that are being staged in Moscow are extraordinary and is already a real pattern. And I can't help but thinking that performance of live bodies in real time before our eyes has something to do not only with that attempt to grapple with historical events, but also the thesis of your book.
Thank you, Nancy. I can't help but agree. Drama, yes, absolutely, absolutely. It was the preeminent art form in the era of Russian modernism. And I think in my perspective, part of that has to do with the ritual origins of drama itself, theater itself. It emerges out of ritual in churches. I think the stage, or as I argue, the stage itself, the fact that in drama, everything happens on a single stage, facilitates a summary quality of drama, an ability. It's not there obviously in every play. Chekhov would have run away from this, but for summarizing human experience, and the most obvious realization of that is the tradition of Theatrum Mundi, the theater of the world, all the worlds, and that's projected out onto the world. The world is a stage, and as far as the relation between drama and other arts forms, one of the most interesting moments I recall doing some of this research was coming across Meyerhold's denigration of the cinema. One would think, oh, Meyerhold, avant-garde theater director, cinema, cutting edge, new art form. And Meyerhold says, basically, what a lousy thing it is. It's just a bunch of, it's just hyper-realism. It cannot elevate anything above what a camera can record. And so, yeah, I agree completely. I think that,
and see, drama is disruptible. That's the thing that's exciting about drama. You go and sit in a play, and you could disrupt it, or it could be disrupted in ways that you can't predict or control. In that sense,
and there's tension within that tradition, because obviously one thing that's happening with avant-garde theater and continues in the Soviet era with playwrights like Mayakovsky is trying to disrupt the cozy little box. I mean, the modernists rebelled against the bourgeois idea, as they labeled it, of the cozy little box of the theater. They wanted to smash down the walls, not least Meyerhold. They wanted to stage things in the open air. But the framework is still that of drama. You're right.
And I'm passing it back to Galin.
Thank you. From drama onto poetry. And in your analysis, Tom, of Akhmatova's poema Bez Geroya, you refer to her phrase, the real 20th century. How do you understand this phrase in relation to the century's recurrent acts of staging the sublime? And what do you think this quality of being real consists in relation to the sublime and its staging?
My reading of that line in Akhmatova is that it is a sobering moment. In other words, because that poem is about the disillusionment of the modernist masquerade. Colleen, I'm going to borrow an idea from you, the modernist masquerade, that the real настоящий 20 век, the real 20th century, was the brutal one that destroyed the modernist play that was going on. So that's my understanding of that phrase.
And just as a follow-up and trying to broaden this and open up its potential relevance for what is on our minds today. Tom, what do you think? What does it mean to be writing about Russian culture today in a world of renewed violence? Not just in Eastern Europe, but beyond.
I wish I had an answer to that, Galin. Let me, as an older person here, say I have been writing about Russian culture through all sorts of eras. It's really still a short chronological span. I mean, we don't live all that long. I mean, I wasn't around in the 15th century, obviously, but I've gone from, somebody was asking me this over the weekend, what was it like being a graduate student in your era? And I said, my first response was, I was a lot younger then. But, and I recalled that in that era, Carol, at Cornell University with you, there was a kind of unstated but assumed sense of mission, not really mission, but of privilege and joy, that we were in the Soviet Union, people could not study, for example, modernism in the way that we could, or emigre literature. And so we were, not that we really felt that we were somehow, guardians of this cultural flame or anything, but it lent meaning to what we were doing. And then, of course, it went through the end of the Soviet era into the Yeltsin era and then the Putin era, and it's always been shifting. What does it mean now? If your question, Galin, was of the type, is it okay to study Russian culture in an era, like, is it moral to study, can one still write lyric poetry after Auschwitz? Can one study Chekhov when Russia has invaded Ukraine? The only slight way in which that did touch the book was in my original version of the manuscript, I had used the term Kiev. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, in the case of Bulgakov, and all of the scholarship on Bulgakov, it is Kiev. And what do you do when you're citing a scholar who wrote without worrying about whether it's Kiev or Kyiv. And I thought, well, I will simply use their terms. And the press asked me, would I please change all of the references to Kyiv? And I said, okay, fine. I don't, this is an evasive non-answer. I don't know what it means. I hope we don't have to abandon the study of Russian culture, because ultimately, possibly, nobody in the CIA or the State Department is going to run out to read my book on ritual in the Soviet era in order to figure out what the Russians are thinking. But it is part of that conversation in its own small way, possibly.
So, Colleen, do we have time for one more question, or would you like it to be turned over to you? What's best for your sense of time? Either way is with us.
Perhaps we can open up the floor, and if people are still processing the conversation and coming up with questions, then we'll turn back to you, Nancy.
Sure.
But let me just open up the conversation and ask if anyone would like to make a comment or has a question for Tom. I think Carol, go ahead.
Yes, I actually have a question for Tom and also a comment for Galin and for Nancy. Let me start with Nancy. This is the easiest one, because you made wonderful comments on staging the sublime. And it occurred to me that what Tom does is stage three really very different goals. Staging the sublime sounds to me like an aesthetic project. Staging the sacred sounds like a metaphysical and religious project. And then you stage the absolutely just. And that's that terrifying aget that we get from you, agetsud, which I'd never thought of entirely as a work of art. So I guess building off of Nancy, Tom, I can ask you, do you make a distinction in your own mind between these three different types of staging, which really are three quite distinct aspects of culture?
Carol, you are characteristically more perceptive than I was when writing it. The only element of that was in my mind was that I became very conscious as I was reading work by Katerina Clark, Christopher Binns, and others who have written about Soviet ritual, that what was missing, there was a tendency to treat it as an aesthetic project. And I saw more in it, but you're absolutely right about the three layers to this. Yeah. So I was half aware of it, I would say. 1/3 aware of it. But yes, they do. That's absolutely right. There are three different strands that come together.
Yeah. And if I could throw my second question quickly at Tom through Galin, and that has to do with the only people, Tom, you talk about in terms of Bakhtin's Carnival, which is a much flayed and, shall we say, distorted concept. You give us Rikhlin and you give us Greuze. Galin, can you defend Bakhtin's Carnival in light of the bad press that it gets in Tom's book?
Well, as you know, Carol, I've always considered his theory of the carnival to be hugely ambivalent, also politically, because whom does he speak for? And what does he speak for? Exactly. When he champions this collective body that clearly is a rejection of the idea of liberal humanism and of privacy and of individual dignity. At the same time, there is this enormously disruptive energy there that is just as constructive as it is disruptive and throwing into disarray our habitual way of accepting hierarchy and tradition. I do think how one answers these questions is also conditioned by our generational positioning vis-a-vis power and violence. And when I asked Tom this question about what it means today to be writing about Russian culture, it's because I didn't have an answer to that question, and I very much liked that he also brought in this generational experience into this question. So defending Bakhtin, yes, in the sense that he moves on this strange cutting edge between acceptance and rejection with due ambivalence, pretty much doing justice to his own theory of carnival and its spirit.
Great. So I think I might jump in here with a question before I turn it back over to Nancy. Tom, first, I want to echo the congratulations that have already been expressed. Your book is written by someone with deep erudition, and it is something which I look at and hope that, you know, with the experience of years of teaching, you've clearly mastered a deep tradition. So wonderful. My question is about the subsurface of orthodoxy. All right, so if your book we could consider to be about a kind of dvoyevirye, a kind of dual faith, where orthodoxy, Orthodox rituals in particular, are seeping through into the Stalinist Soviet culture. What if we look before Christianity, right, to the sort of pre-Christian pagan period, which is also richly embedded in Russian modernist culture? You know, we can think of something like Prince Igor by Borodin, which has the Polovtsian dances, and of course, Stravinsky's spectacular Rite of Spring from 1915. Michael Kunichika has written also about the pagan culture and the interest in archaeology that sort of inspired a number of modernist writers, including Khlebnikov and Zangezi. So I'm just curious, you know, how many layers are there to this onion, right? How deep is the substrate? Do you see the Stalinist period as one that does not have the pre-Christian sort of pagan qualities? Yeah, how many layers are there in the onion?
I think how best to answer that. In the case of rituals that lead to show trials, this is Christian. Not to say it's a Christian activity, but I mean, it is attributable to Christian culture in Europe from the Middle Ages onward, and not to pre-Christian. But in another context, I've argued that what I see as a distinct performative moment in Soviet literature can be traced back via Dostoevsky to the Skamarok in medieval Rus, Kievan Rus, and the Skamarok as a representative of a pre-Christian religion who was forced after conversion to perform and in order to appease and placate power, and this got embedded in Russian culture. So there are elements in Soviet culture, certainly. Like, I mean, Russia is a relatively old culture that doesn't forget. But on thinking of the Stalinist rituals in particular, I don't argue this at length, and I'm certainly not the first to make this observation, that Stalin was a seminary student. And Stalin was very much aware of Christian rituals and how they could be exploited. As far as the early Soviet rituals, one interesting thing I discovered was that I began with the assumption that the Christian element would have been unacknowledged and latent. They didn't realize that they were actually replicating processions of the cross and so forth, so it came naturally to it. But there was an interesting kind of tension because they went back and forth. They did it quite consciously early on.
As Zach mentioned in the chat, if anybody wishes to indicate that they have a question, put up your Zoom hand. Okay. And I see Anna has one. Anna, please.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, thank you so much for this very stimulating book. It helped me to think through some things that have been on my mind recently. And it's actually been the narrative of the Exodus in Iron Flow by Serafimovich. Maybe you remember we discussed it at some point. And your discussion of parades in the 5th chapter sort of reminded me of some of the elements of that narrative, right? Like Stalin being on some sort of a mountain almost, right? Which is a mausoleum, you know, people passing by. There's this element of like staging the sublime as well, right? That is described in the Book of the Exodus, where like all this you know, flashes and thunder and, you know, like the voice speaking, you know, like through all of that. So like, so there's an element of a spectacle, and the moment of a trial, I guess, that is also pertinent for your discussion. So I guess I was wondering whether you think there is a more widespread application of that narrative in the Stalinist culture than just an isolated case of Serafimovich?
Yes, is the short answer to that. And if the question is about the presence in Soviet culture of an Old Testament narrative, in effect, yes, I would say, but via Christianity, but then also in parallel, Marx is essentially a rewriting of Exodus. And you know, the proletariat's journey to the promised land. Marx is saturated with this sensibility and mentality, and that I think also was picked up by Soviet writers, Serafimovich among them.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I see we have a question from Adam.
Thank you for such a stimulating, interesting talk. I had a question about the individual versus the collective, and I wondered whether it's a sort of dominant feature of the rituals you talk about, that the individual is only allowed a presence when confessing, as it were, and that confession takes the form really of a kind of secularized sort of kenosis, a kind of self-emptying, something that's known in Western Christianity, but is particularly prominent in the Eastern traditions. And with this repeated instances of this self-emptying, where it becomes a sort of a process, it becomes a part of the spectacle that's repeated, becomes part of the kind of theatrical genre. You know, there's this element of, it becomes an element of spectacle, in other words. I wonder if that's something that's particularly prominent in your view. Thank
you. It's a very astute observation. I would say certainly the show trials represented the ascendancy of the collective over the individual, or the crushing of the individual who is forced, as you put it very well, the individual is present only as somebody who is confessing to a crime prior to being eliminated. There's an interesting shift that's noted in the scholarship on Soviet rituals between the 20s and the 30s, between the Leninist era, if you want to call it that, and the Stalinist era, is that even these state-sponsored, managed rituals change character. They go from being stagings of collective support for the regime. It's coerced, it's run by the state. This is not a spontaneous gathering. But it goes even from that, where in effect, the crowd is legitimized as the agent of the festival, to being festivals paraded before one observer, who is Stalin. Right. There's even, you know, there's a further degradation of the individual. And I was a little worried. I did not want to come across as somehow attacking Bakhtin, but one line that I liked from Boris Groys in his article on Carnival was about, you know, the individual being entirely lost, even in medieval Carnival, as Bakhtin describes it. And one of the best lines in it, just as a quip, as an ironic commentary, is "Не дай Бог там оказаться." God forbid you end up in the middle of a medieval carnival. You know, this collective body puking and defecating and, you know, drinking and all of this. God forbid you be overwhelmed by that. So I just want ritual, the individual has to be, at the very least, subsumed within a collective ritual. Does the collective, sorry, just come back very briefly, does the collective gain a sort of a kind of personality, kind of личность? I'm thinking of Kharkhodin's обличать и лицемерить here, and whether is that, or is it something that is not identifiable? In my view, not really, and I would tend to agree, although he exaggerates some things tendentiously with Riklin's analysis of what happens to the collective under Stalinism, that the subway decorations are simply displays of how the collective has been completely suppressed.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Great. So I see we have a question in the chat box, which I'll read, and then we'll turn to Elena. So the question from Raymond Arendt is, did Korenizatsiya have any influence on Soviet rituals, i.e. in Soviet non-Russian republics?
Did what have influence?
Korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya.
I have to beg ignorance about really what's going on in non-Soviet republics, because it well could have, but this is something beyond the purview of the book. I mean, the easy answer is, of course, all these things were replicated in other republics and so forth. But yeah, I would have to look into that.
Yeah, indigenization. That's correct, Raymond.
Yeah. That I understand. I understand the question. I just can't answer it.
Good. Okay, Elena, please.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. The parts of the book that I read were absolutely wonderful. And my question is a follow-up to the whole carnival issue that we've been discussing so far. So you mentioned, right, Groys's point that the individual is lost in carnival, but so is transcendence, right? And the rituals that you're describing have that compulsory element of transcendence, right? And carnival replaces eschatology with scatology. And so I was thinking about what happens at kind of another turn of the century, at another point of like an imminent collapse. And so I'm thinking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and things like neorealism, for example, and like, are there forms of the kind of carnivalesque that very explicitly kind of capitalize on the lack of the transcendent aspect of carnival? So I'm guessing there was a question somewhere in there, but would you say that?
I think I follow your question and comment. First of all, I intended in the book to discuss Bakhtin simply as a reflection of these things going on. In other words, in essence, what I'm saying is, well, now we see why Bakhtin is writing about these things, because they're in the culture. As far as the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of that, I remember, Carol, I somehow remember being in a forum with you. Where was this? Some conference we were talking, this was early on, and it was in the wake of Francis Fukuyama's, infamous now article about the end of history. And I made the comment that, well, far from this being the end of history, history has just begun in Russia. Now I think they are trying to go back to escape history once again by setting up a mythological medieval continuation of a medieval historical moment. But what was happening in the early 90s, with all the attendant horrors in a way, was the return to history in Russia, where there was no overarching transcendent absolute agenda. And one feels lost in Russia.
Okay, so we've got about 3 minutes left. I see one more question in the chat box. So let's take this question and then I'll turn it back over to Daniela. Okay, so this question is from Dmitry Sidorov. Why is late, i.e. post-World War II Stalinist period not part of the book?
One can only do so much, and it could be extended undoubtedly, but I wanted, as I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, I wanted there to be a narrative arc to this that would go to the culmination, which I saw as being the show trials. So the show trials for me in this examination are the end of it. Yes, it could be extended. It gets more complicated, I think, in the post-Stalinist period. The rituals are preserved, obviously, with the death of Stalin. Terz, in his essay on socialist realism, famously says they made a huge mistake when they didn't deify Stalin. It's a tongue-in-cheek remark, but it's come to the same set of issues underlying Soviet culture. Gee, we blew it. We should have declared that he ascended into heaven.
Right.
So yeah, it could be continued. It just wasn't part of this project.
I don't know what words to end a book chat than to say this can be continued in the next publication.
May I make a final comment of gratitude to Nancy?
Yes.
I'm so grateful, Nancy, that you said the book might be useful to MA students and PhD students. Your comment was sort of in the vein of it contains a lot of the reading list. And this both disturbs and gratifies me because I think it was when my second book came out, my son, who was very young then, said, Papa, when are you going to write a book that people want to read? And so if people want to read it for their MA and PhD exam,
oh,
I've
absolutely
at least made some progress.
It's much more suitable than you intended or you realized.
Anyway, thank you all.
We are at time, so I want to thank very much Professors Galin Tihanov and Nancy Condee for joining us in conversation with Tom Seifrid, Colleen McQuillen for moderating, and above all, thank you, Tom, and many, many congratulations on this wonderful book.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for joining us.